of the Republicans, especially as the minority party in the legislature, where they cannot vote for the bill and it's going to go through in the House especially, I mean, how do they make a stand to change the dialogue from being this villains and sound clips to issues and principles?
Well, the first thing I would do, if, my advice to Republicans would be simple. In the district of every Democrat who voted for the bailout, make sure you're running ads next week that say, your member voted for the bonuses at AIG. Because Dodd put the paragraph in there which nobody read when they voted yes, and I'd say, go ask your member why they voted for the bonuses for AIG, why you're paying $450 million to a company that you're going to loan $200 billion to. Because your member did it. Here's the date and here's the vote. You do about 3 weeks of that, you're going to find about half the Democrats no longer vote with Pelosi. Because they can't go back home and defend this stuff. It's crazy. Yes, sir.
Back to the Bush-Obama economic plan. Do you, what do you think about the possibility that these bailouts and these guarantees, had they not been put in place, the market would have just gone straight to the ground, and another depression could have happened?
No, it would have gone straight to the ground and would have bounced back. Historically, we've been through a whole series of panics. 1837, 1857, 1873, 1891, I'm sorry, 1895, 1907, 1920. And historically what happened is it went down very fast, and everybody who was really stupid lost a whole lot of money very quickly, and everybody who was pretty smart began buying up all the properties because they had money. And within 18 months, it began coming back. What we're in danger of doing is creating the Japanese economy, which just, I mean, this is very important to your generation. You guys could be trapped in a job market, in an opportunity market that permanently underperforms for 20 years. That's how big a problem this is. And this is about your careers. Yes, sir.
Do you think it would be fair to say that while this strategy may be effective if labeled against Nancy Pelosi and Reid, House and Senate, it may not be effective when targeted against like an Obama bailout, when his popularity is so high and the American voters are still very tied to his
His current
success?
approval rating is lower than George W. Bush at the same point in 2001. And he's dropped about 15 points. And the fact is, I don't describe it as an Obama plan. If I described it as an Obama plan, I would be a partisan. I describe it as a Bush-Obama plan. I mean, how much more nonpartisan can you get than that? I think it was nuts in both administrations. I said so last year. And I said publicly last year that Paulson was the worst Secretary of the Treasury in American history, that he had opened up a nightmare, and it was just going to get steadily worse. Well, I would say this week is an example of getting worse. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir, but it's easy to say that Bush is a bad guy now when his approval rating is at 25%, but in 2004 you were behind him.
When?
In 2004, in 2000.
Yeah, I'm given a choice of Bush or Kerry. Yeah.
Well, I understand that.
But in December of 2003, I was also in Newsweek and a Meet the Press saying that in Iraq we'd gone off the cliff. Public direct quote.
That was when it turned out to be an unpopular war.
No, it was long before it was unpopular. I said that Bremer was destroying our strategy in Iraq, and I said that starting in June of 03 we had gone off a cliff. You can look it up. It's in December Newsweek and it's on Meet the Press.
If the government is incapable of managing or regulating the economy, then in terms of asymmetric information, like with collateralized debt obligations and really smart people who are able to design with their financial models derivatives and things like that, how else can you prevent something like what happened from happening again, yet people putting debt off their books in a different way, if not through what they've done so far?
Well, first of all, there's a difference between regulating and managing. I mean, I'm a Theodore Roosevelt Republican. For example, I like the fact that everywhere in America I can go into a restaurant and I drink clean water. That's entirely an act of government. And I'm not a true libertarian, because true libertarians would argue you really don't need a clean water law because, you know, your surviving relatives could sue. And the threat of suit would keep people from giving you bad water. I mean, I frankly think that's a very high risk. So I agree. This is part of why I cited the progressive movement earlier, because the progressive movement is a really fundamental breakpoint in American history. And it really fundamentally redefines the role of government in a way that's very important. So but I also would argue, if you go back here, Hamilton is for very strong government. He's just for very limited strong government. He wants a sound dollar. He wants a tariff policy that leads to the building of manufacturing. He wants us to absorb the national debt so that all of the Dutch bondholders have a vested interest in the United States succeeding. These are not weak. This is not a weak government. The Federalists were for a strong but very limited government. And the reason they were for a limited government was their experience of the British. And you really see this if you read Gordon Wood's History of the American Revolution and his History of the Creation of the American Republic. And Gordon is one of the people who taught me. He's a professor at Brown. And I mean, he taught me in the sense he came down to the Capitol and we had dinner and spent hours on this. The Jeffersonian critique of big government is that it is inherently corrupting. And this is the core reason we go through all of this stuff with campaign reform and lobbying reform. You have a government which spends $4 or $5 trillion. You're going to have so many choices and so many opportunities. You are inherently corrupting the system. And you found this last year. Why was Bear Stearns handled one way? And remember, Paulson wanted to actually lower the price, and they'd already been offered a higher price than the price Paulson wanted it sold for. Now, why is the Secretary of the Treasury defining the price of a company? By what right is Geithner now intervening to tell them they can't have the bonuses? Because once you get involved in this kind of micromanagement, who decides? You know, at one point last year, the Securities and Exchange Commission decided they would protect 799 companies from being shorted. And I said at the time, how did they get to the number 799? I'd like to see the discussion and the paperwork that it wasn't 797 and it wasn't 801. This is not the rule of law. This is just pure, personalistic, bureaucratic decision-making that is inevitably corruptible. And so you start with the idea that you do want regulations, but you want the regulations to be transparent, you want them to be clear, you want them to be enforced. So 2 points about all these fancy things. The first is, all these stunningly clever people who designed all this stuff were really pretty stupid. And the fact is, if we'd allowed them to pay the cost of their stupidity, they'd all gone broke. And I don't mind if Harvard MBAs go broke and Wharton MBAs go broke and Kellogg MBAs go broke, because they were all out on the edge because they were so arrogant and they had so much hubris. They thought that they had eliminated history. They thought things that went up never came down. And that's an important reason for letting people go broke, because you want to teach a generational lesson. Don't be stupid. Now we're not teaching that. What we're teaching now is find a politician. That's a very dangerous model. Second, people ought to have a pretty good rule here. Be careful what you buy. You know, if something looks too good, it might be. And I think that there are things. You may well want to say that institutions that are certified by the U.S. government can't have derivatives. That if there are certain things that are unknowable, we should define them as unknowable. And then frankly, you move them from Wall Street to Las Vegas. You call them gambling, not investment, and you don't worry about it. I mean, adults who want to go and wager on things that are crazy, allow them to do it, but then say to them, no parachute. I mean, you want to take your money and go to Hong Kong and invest it in a really stupid idea? Fine. That's what a free country is. This is one of the key challenges we're going to have in the next 10 years, the dialogue about what is freedom. Should you be free to make a mistake, or should the bureaucracy protect you from yourself?
All right, this is the AIG question. I don't know. You say that the country could sustain it if AIG went bankrupt.
Sure.
And all these credit default swaps and the bank balances, whatever. Some people say not. But whatever it is, AIG has, through these derivatives, they have an enormous impact on the banking system in the country. Is there anything that government could or should have done at some point to say, we're not going to leave, we have three different branches of government here, the founding fathers of the general. Is there something to be said for the fact that we're not going to be vulnerable to the stupidity of one country, of one company? That one company amasses so much of these instruments that its failure will either, according to some, wreck the American economy, according to others, hurt severely the American economy.
Yeah, look, I'm a Theodore Roosevelt Republican in the sense that one of my conclusions out of the last 10 years is, if you are too big to fail, you're too big to manage.
Okay.
And I would break up Fannie Mae, I'd break up Freddie Mac, I would break up AIG. I frankly wouldn't defend any of the biggest banks. And I'd say if you're too big to be managed, you need to become smaller.
But again, and I know it's all hindsight, but for the future, should we as a country have a distrust of this kind of bigness? Because actually what it says, AIG, they sold a product, a credit default swap or derivative. People bought the product. They were engaged in a classic barter sense relationship, weren't they?
Look, I think what you have to have is a different kind of. The AIG credit swap problem is a different kind of problem. Somebody from Zurich Re told me that the reason they were the second biggest insurance company, they're now the biggest because of the shrinkage of AIG. The reason that Zurich Re did not go into this stuff is that the head of the company tried to understand it.
Yeah.
And he couldn't. Now, one of the things that should bother all of you, and this is true for Bob Rubin at Citibank, and it's true for all these guys. You had all these boards that were making money because they were supposed to be doing due diligence. You had all these CEOs who were making money because they're supposed to be chief executive officer. After everything we did with Sarbanes-Oxley and all this talk about how you had to file accurately, et cetera, it now turns out none of these guys understood any of this stuff. That's a serious problem, and it's one we have not been willing to hold hearings on. We haven't been willing to hold hearings to say, how could you approve billions of dollars being invested in things you clearly didn't understand?
But if you were to speak at a House in 2004, or not to make it personal, what could the government have done to prevent a company like AIG from amassing from having a position to, according to some, severely wounding the American economy, according to some, killing the damn thing? How?
Look, it's clear in retrospect there should have been a lot more hearings on the whole rise of derivatives and credit swap. The people literally didn't understand it at any level. There's no question about that. I think it's also clear in retrospect that the last years of Greenspan's chairmanship, that they kept the price of money way too low.
Right.
And I think that clearly led to the housing bubble, and the housing bubble is part of this. I also think, though, that some of this, we began to discover, this is not new. Barings, I think that's the name of the firm, it's an old British firm from the 1820s, went broke because a 29-year-old in Singapore played games with it. This was like 8 or 9 years ago. Right. I mean, so we've known for a while that there were systemic capability of random guys. I mean, the one guy who did most of the damage to AIG is retired in London, and the damage was done in London. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's serious questions about what would the right kind of transparency be. Part of the difference between the current system, and this is a good argument for why you've got to rethink the whole system. In the 1930s, people like Sam Rayburn, as chairman of the Commerce Committee, held endless hearings trying to understand what went wrong. Because they did want to go back and write new law, and they wanted to figure out new things. I don't think we've had anything like the number of hearings we ought to have that aren't gotcha hearings, but they're actually, how did it happen, and why did it happen, and what were people doing, and what did they think was going on? And I think, frankly, a lot of very senior, sophisticated people would be stunningly embarrassed.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Can I bring us back to the
Yes.
class? Because, speak to this, Steve Schmidt was here, and he said when McCain famously, notoriously, and critically, mortally ruining his campaign, parachuted in post-Lehman to pretend to potentially be a free marketeer, because at that point, you're right, Bush was redistributing wealth. He said that they were in a room, and you were there because you were on the Hill. He said they were told, and we were told this by the Obama people and everybody, every smart person in the world said if they didn't do that, even if it was against every free market instinct, which he wanted to do politically, the entire global economy would collapse. And then they moved with the velocity that we now know, which precluded all of what you just said should have happened. How did we get here, Pasadena, and all that in the first place? That political, if we were not in that heat of a political environment, would there have been some mechanism for us to take a step back, take a breath? You were talking about mark to market and that kind of stuff, but is it even possible to have sanity at that period of time in our political system.
Well, it's not possible if you have the three people who were at the center of this. You had Bernanke, who's an academic from Princeton. You had Paulson, who was a trader at Goldman Sachs. And you had Geithner, who's a bureaucrat. And those three guys...
And McCain,
But it doesn't work like that. I mean, it's kind of like saying, I own the airplane, okay? And we're at 35,000 feet, and there are thunderstorms ahead. And what decision should I make? Well, I guarantee you, and Callista will reinforce this cheerfully, we actually asked the pilots. You know, and I don't look out and go, hey, I mean, I've been flying airplanes a lot. I put in more hours than most pilots. I got a feel for this baby. I'm ready, I know. You know, we say, you know, what's the radar? That's right. You know. So you start with, you turn to the guys who you appoint because you think they're supposed to know something. Now,
that's not what a leader is. A leader has to like make a judgment.
Look,
Not all smart people are smart.
Look, I flinched. I flinched fully as much as McCain did because I issued a statement that as much as I hated it and as much as I disliked it and as angry as it made me, I thought the only responsible vote on the first round was to vote yes, because you have everybody saying to you there will be a heart attack. And I wasn't prepared to take on my shoulders the responsibility of saying that I knew so much more than Paulding, Bernanke, and Geithner combined that I was going to say, don't worry about it, okay? So I flinched too. What I'm telling you now is, in retrospect, looking at the mess we're in, what I said beforehand and afterwards, because there's only 2 days where I was even close to not being at war with Paulson. I was at war with Paulson for 2 months. I did everything I could to get people to understand how bad this was. And part of the reason is they have been desperately protecting the creditors. You know, they don't mind wiping out the stockholders. They don't mind.
Why were they protecting the creditors? Well, I mean, did it protect them because they were all born to the same club? I mean, was there a macroeconomic reason to protect the creditors? Or what would they say?
What would they say?
Yeah.
Not the truth.
Well,
Well,
no. I think they would say that the unknown consequences of losing faith in the paper of the United States and the idea that we would tolerate literally trillions of dollars of paper value disappearing would be so horrendous that you can't tell what it might mean.
And what would you say? We're having, all right, so here I'm Paulson. I'm not going to do this because I eat lunch with all these guys and went to college with them. Okay.
Right.
He's going to say, look, Newt, you have an event like this and this paper evaporates, you're going to have a cataclysmic event that's going to affect stuff around the world. And at that point, then what are you and Paulson are behind closed doors?
What I would say, and this is all obviously evolving over time.
I understand, but that's okay.
So what I would say is this. We've been through a fairly painful period of decline that began with housing and accelerated. We're now at a point where we got to make a decision to go in one of two directions. And I'm not going to put, I mean, obviously, I think this is mine and this is theirs, but here are the choices. And this is why I suggested earlier reading Drucker and thinking about this stuff. I believe the long-term downward consequence of allowing politicians and bureaucrats to dominate the American economy, the fiasco you're watching every day. I mean, it now turns out that Chris Dodd, who is the largest recipient of AIG money, is putting a special loophole in the 787 billion page bill that nobody read, so that AIG can pay the $450 million. And now that the public has learned about it, they're enraged. And so now we're going to go back and mug AIG. I mean, just think about the stuff that's beginning to build here. This is the breakdown of the rule of law, I think, for the first time in American history, where we're basically saying the law is what the president, 218 House members, and 60 senators say it is, and if they decide to rip you off, confiscate your property, ex post facto, go back and say, we've now changed the rules again. Why would anybody invest in that kind of world? This is like Nigeria. This is Indonesia. I mean, this is the kind of third world behavior that guarantees no capitalist comes in and invests anything. And why would you want to go out and become a CEO so Biden could say, throw you in the brig? It's much better to be a trial lawyer, something noble, or to become a bureaucrat, something stable. And how could you possibly believe that a Treasury bureaucracy, which goes to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, is going to keep up with the world market? It can keep up with core regulatory assignments. It can't possibly move at the pace of the world market. And that just guarantees that major American systems are just going to break down, become less and less efficient, and begin to just disintegrate. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I guess more a practical question about your party then, because I think you've articulated an actual direction we can go in, which I haven't really heard from the leaders in the House, from the Republicans. And I'm wondering why do you think they're talking like about salt marsh mice in San Francisco with the stimulus debate and trying to frame it like that?
Well, I think as of today they're talking about Dodd and the special goodie for AIG. Remember, nobody knew this stuff was there. I mean, I said at the time, and this is a very important lesson for all of you to remember. You can pass a bill really quickly, but it doesn't go away. It becomes a fact. So all these guys who voted quickly to get it through before anybody read it are now stuck with a bill nobody knows. You think Dodd's fiasco is the last thing that's going to come out of this bill? But I have to confess, in terms of a $787 billion emergency jobs creation bill, the idea of $30 million for the salt marsh mouse in San Francisco is almost irresistible. The idea of Pelosi protecting the mouse. We tried at one point to do. We wanted to do a YouTube video actually of a combination of Harry Reid's train from Disney World or Disneyland to Las Vegas and the mouse, and maybe have the mouse ride in the train and say this is because it was sort of the perfect symbolic example of just how stupid this whole process has gotten. Yes.
So if you want to let Wall Street fall on their sword and remove the parachute from executives, how do you then not come across as punishing the American worker and middle class America for the sins of Wall Street? Because ultimately the jobs that evaporate, was that you're punishing somebody for the sins of somebody in New York on Main Street.
We put out 3 weeks ago at American Solutions what we called 12 American Solutions for Jobs and Prosperity. And we said if you actually want to turn the economy around quickly, the first thing on our list is a 50% credit for paying the Social Security and Medicare tax, including the employees and the employers. So any of you who have been to work full time, go back and look at how much you were paying in Social Security tax and Medicare tax. Imagine that you got half that amount every week in your paycheck, and imagine that your employer was allowed to keep half that amount for all the people that work for him. You suddenly reliquify middle-class America, small business America, self-employed America, which is a big winner in that proposal. The second thing we proposed is, if you really want to create American jobs, match the Chinese capital gains rate, which is 0. If you have 0 capital gains overnight, you put about $1 trillion of value back into 401ks and back into college savings accounts and into pension plans. Third thing we said is, if you really want to compete with the world market in creating jobs, match the Irish corporate tax rate, which is 12.5%. Now, I can give you a whole set of things you could do that would make life dramatically better for normal, middle-class, working, small and medium-sized businesses. But it wouldn't bail out AIG, and it wouldn't bail out Citibank, and it wouldn't help Wall Street. So there are a lot of ways to create jobs in America that don't require you to pay off the big boys who are stupid. Yes?
But what do you say about, first of all, given that Social Security is a pay-as-you-go program that already has funding problems of its own, how do you reconcile with cutting
Because you
revenue?
put it in as a 50% offset, so you take the very money we were going to give AIG and you put it in the Social Security Trust Fund.
Okay.
It's exactly the same, it's a pass-through.
And also, what do you say about the correlation between the fact that corporate profits tax and the top income tax rate has gone down pretty consistently, with a few ups in there, but gone down pretty consistently since the 1970s. And the fact that the income of the median family, that the incomes at the top have increased, but incomes of the median family have barely gone up.
First of all, corporate tax rates haven't gone down. The corporate income tax in America today is the second highest in the world, and if you add in state income taxes, it's the highest. We have the highest business tax rate in the world. So it just hasn't come down. I think that's a fairly important thing. Yes?
I just want to refer back to that. If you're too big to fail, you're too big to manage. Doesn't the conservative economic model just inherently encourage these economies to scale with aggregating multiple corporations into one and making the cheapest good possible and lowering the market as far as you can, preferring, I guess a race to the bottom. I mean, who is to tell them?
Why is it a race to the bottom?
I mean, that's,
why is the rise of Toyota the race to the bottom?
I mean, economies of scale always win.
But why is that a race
biggest
to the bottom?
company
Why isn't it a race to the top?
Okay, it is a race to the top, but I'm saying, if you're saying they need to break up.
No, slow down.
If you're saying they need to break up, then who is to tell them to break up?
Do American consumers have a greater range of choices because they can go to a Walmart superstore with 258,000 items, or are they in fact racing to the bottom? And do you have a greater range of choices in automobiles because the Toyota production system is dramatically more efficient and more productive than its competitors? And it's very important because the language of the left is all of this stuff is bad, okay? Well, all of this stuff is what made the modern world. It's what gave 300 million Chinese a chance to be middle class and 300 million Indians a chance to be middle class. And it's what made us the most successful country in history. If you ever notice, even today with all of our economic problems, the number of people trying to get in is radically bigger than the number of people trying to get out. Because at a common sense, practical level, people around the planet understand your children have a greater chance to achieve wealth in America than anywhere in the world. So I'm very much, but my point is, you get to be big enough that the CEO doesn't know what he's doing, you're probably too big to be successful.
But that's when you're making the most profits.
Not necessarily. Not General Motors.
I mean,
These companies, some of these companies have been on the ropes for 20 years, but they're so big they decay slowly.
there's no small automobile manufacturers. It just wouldn't be efficient.
Well, okay. Let's talk about successful American auto plants. BMW in South Carolina, Mercedes in Alabama, Hyundai in Alabama, Kia in Alabama, Nissan in Tennessee, Toyota in Kentucky, Honda in Ohio. Now, how come they're all successful? Do you think the American workers that migrate to those plants are genetically superior to the UAW members? No, they're successful because they all have management structures and work structures that focus on quality, focus on efficiency, and actually focus on getting the job done. And they don't, by the way, have labor pools you can be in for 2 full years of salary while doing nothing, which is what the big three signed with the UAW. Yes?
To use the language of Thomas Kuhn, to whom you alluded earlier, do you think that a shift to the paradigm of the Hayeks and the Friedmans is possible after the economic trouble suffered under Bush, who was all about the free market? Whether he was actually or not is to be debated, but ostensibly he was all about free trade, free market, and so forth. Do you think a shift to that paradigm is possible now that people are sort of advocating a sort of Keynesian approach?
Well, I mean, Keynes is, there's a big difference. Keynes is a question of whether or not you use government purchasing power to increase demand, okay? I can increase demand by having a 50% offset against the FICA tax for Social Security and Medicare, and I can increase demand overnight. But except I'm having you do the demand, I'm having you be a customer, I'm having you decide which companies survive based on your decision as a customer. But that's a Keynesian policy. It's not a bureaucratic policy. What's happening in Washington today is not about Keynes versus general economics. I mean, Keynes is a subset of general economics. What's happening in Washington today is an effort to transfer power to the bureaucracy and the politicians. It's a very deliberate, systematic effort. I think it's very compelling that page 11, all of you can go check this out since you're students and you're used to doing research. Go check out page 11 of the budget of the United States that was issued about a week ago. Does anybody here know what's on page 11? This will replace the mouse that some of you were worried about protecting. Page 11 is a chart done by 2 French socialist economists. Now, how somebody in the White House could have been foolish enough to take Ségolène Royal, who was the socialist candidate for president in France, to take her economic advisor and put him in the budget of the United States is just beyond me. I mean, it allows me to go around the country cheerfully and say, I would not actually talk about the degree to which this administration wants to have French socialism if they weren't insisting on putting it in their own budget. But it's a fact. Oh, it is their highly distorted version of the inequality of distribution of wealth in which they do not include any income redistribution. So they don't include Social Security payments. They don't include. What?
Do we have wealth inequality grown in this country in the last 30 years?
To some extent, sure.
Okay.
Speaker, it's on the screen behind you.
Ah, good. Poor. Okay? Now, it turns out top 1% of earners have been increased. This document is entirely based on income tax returns. So it doesn't include earned income tax credit. It doesn't include any kind of transfers. It doesn't include Social Security payments. And it's fundamentally misleading. Because the amount of money that actually is non-income in America today has gone up from 34 to 38% in the 90s, in the last decade. So the people who are relatively poor have actually gotten far more government transfers in the last 20 years. And it's just fundamentally misleading. But what I liked about it was somebody who says the fact that this guy was a French socialist who advised Ségolène Royal is irrelevant tells me all I need to know about the bias of the person who put this in the budget. So if I say to you, look, if you think the French economy is a terrific future and at your age you'd rather live in the French economy, my only advice is read Sarkozy's book Testimony, which is the book he wrote as a candidate in which he says, interesting statistic, before Margaret Thatcher, the French economy was 25% bigger than the British economy. Today, the British economy is 10% bigger than the French economy. And 400,000 French men and women work in London because they get better jobs in London. And he goes on to say, if we don't fix the economy, you won't have a pension and you won't have a health plan. So everybody in the country who likes their pension plan, you'd better hope we can fix the French economy. And everybody in France who likes their health plan, you better hope we can fix the French economy, because if we don't fix it, we can't pay for it. Now, I think that's a pretty good debate for us to have as a country. Because I want to put up a number that should sober you. Remember I said earlier that FDR was the greatest political leader of the 20th century, which he was. I mean, it's a pure political skill. I know of nobody in his league. He was not a very good economic leader. This was the unemployment rate in 1939. 10 years after the beginning of the Great Depression, we were at 15% unemployment. So my argument is I'm not particularly interested in doing what Hoover did, and I'm not particularly interested in doing what FDR did, because I don't regard getting back to 15% unemployment as a great achievement. Yes, sir.
Well, I think getting to that number from 25% in less than 10 years is a really good achievement. And unemployment only rose under FDR when he started to try to balance the budget
by raising taxes.
Conservative things that his predecessor had done.
By raising taxes. I mean, capital goes on strike in 37, 38 because he does almost exactly what Biden's doing. He attacks business, he attacks people who are successful, and he raises taxes. And people who are successful say, why would I want to come play? There's a very good book called The Forgotten Man by Amity Shlaes that's worth looking at as a real serious warning about what could happen. Yes?
Getting back to electoral politics, the Republican Party's been hemorrhaging moderate voters. Chris Shays was the last member of Congress from New England. Now he's not there anymore. You have a vocal far-right wing faction that's hostile towards moderate Republicans. They're rhinos, they're liberals. How does the Republican Party have a governing majority with this electoral environment? How do they get back in a majority? What is their message need to be?
The party has to change. One of the slogans, I wrote a book called Real Change. And one of the slogans we use is that real change requires real change. And I would argue that the prospect of an energy tax of $1,300 a family or more will open up New England in ways you can't imagine. And that there are a lot of things going on right now where you could easily see a new coalition reassemble very rapidly. Yes?
Speaker, do you think that one of the possibilities for the Republican Party is to ally with some of the Blue Dog Democrats who voted against the stimulus bill?
Yeah, I actually think, and you'll see this first on health care, that there will be a split in the Democratic Party which actually may be more generational than ideological. If you look at health policy in the House, the people who dominate health policy in the Democratic Party in the House are John Dingell, who was first elected in 1956, and his father had held the seat since 1936. So the family's actually been in the seat for 73 years. And Dingell actually likes his father's 1937 National Health Plan. Henry Waxman, who came, I think, in 1970 or 72, and represents sort of a Southern California liberalism of the Vietnam War era, and Pete Stark, who comes from San Francisco in 1974 and represents a very left-wing view going towards national health care, and then Barney Frank, who I saw on TV Sunday saying, I mean, what he wants is basically is a national health care system on the British model. Now, those guys represent an older and different world, and I think what you're going to find, not just geographically, not just the blue dogs, but a whole two generations of younger Democrats who live in a different world. I mean, they live in a world of BlackBerries and Twitter and iPods and YouTube and ATM machines and cell phones with cameras, and they just know that it's different than the world of Stark and Waxman and Dingell. Yes, ma'am.
Along the lines of attracting and aligning with other people, we've been talking a lot about the rise of minority groups, and how does the Republican Party address that?
Well, I think in a city that has a Vietnamese congressman who's a Republican and a governor who's Indian American who's a Republican, it's a great place to talk about how you address that. You recruit people who decide they share your values. But I'll give you an example. Indian Americans own 40% of the hotel rooms in the United States. Now, what would you guess the average Indian American hotel owner thinks about the union effort to eliminate the right to a secret ballot? Would you like to take a guess? Indians are the leading entrepreneurial group in Silicon Valley. About half of the entrepreneurial firms in Silicon Valley have an Indian co-founder. How do you think they feel about zero capital gains? I mean, just start down a list. I mean, look, I'm not defending the old Republican Party, as I think both Mary and James will tell you. I have been cheerfully a rebel from the day I first started getting active in politics and first ran for office in '74. I think that the Republican Party has to change fundamentally, and I think if it doesn't change fundamentally, it won't successfully govern. Yes, sir.
I saw the newspaper this morning that you were also in town for a fundraiser for Congressman Gowan. With regard to your last comment, do you think that his election was more because people shared his values, or because the base of William Jefferson didn't get out for the third election because they thought the election was already over?
I think a lot of different things. I think it probably didn't help Jefferson much to have $90,000 in cash in his refrigerator. I mean, I think even among Democrats that was a tad ripe. So I think that probably weakened him as an incumbent. But look, this is something that I think James would agree with me on this principle. Politics is not linear. This is one of the things where I most deeply disagree with my Republican consultant friends. Cal runs in 2007 in a field of 6 for state legislature and comes in 5th. Turns around, comes back the next year and thinks, I think this guy Jefferson is mortally wounded. I think he's a crook. I think people are going to be tired of him. So he runs. Now, there is no mathematical model on the planet that would take a guy who came in 5th for a state legislative seat and say to him, what we need in this majority black district is a Vietnamese guy who ran 5th, and why don't you get out there and run? And this is what makes politics endlessly fascinating. And all three of us, Mary too, have had campaigns with various people where, you can't imagine in advance that this person can win. And something happens, there's some magic. So I just started with the idea, I think he has a very tough race next year. On the other hand, I think he's a very attractive person who works very, very hard. And I think it's going to be interesting to watch. And I believe very deeply, some of you will find this slightly bizarre. Callista, a couple years ago, got me several of the Edgar Rice Burroughs Mars series. I don't know how many of you know this, but Edgar Rice Burroughs, who was most famous for writing Tarzan, wrote a whole series of novels about Mars that are sort of very early science fiction. And he has this one guy whose basic statement over and over is, where there's life, there's hope. And so you get into these, these were real potboilers written in the 20s and 30s. And you get this scene where, hanging by a thread over the pit with the huge animal about to eat him with nothing else going, the hero promptly says, don't despair, where there's life, there's hope. And then, of course, something good happens. That's politics at its best. I mean, you can't track Obama from state Senate through U.S. Senate to taking on Hillary Clinton to winning the presidency. You cannot track Lincoln from one term in the U.S. House to the presidency. It is impossible to invent a computer game in which Lincoln wins the presidency. And so you just have to decide, try to find out. Yes, ma'am.
To prepare for this class, we read an article written by Karl Rove, in which he said that the Republican Party should not move away from social conservatism. Do you agree or disagree with this?
Well, I agree in the core principle that for the Republican Party to attempt to be an anti-social conservative party would guarantee a third party. And I mean, you would be like, why don't we reinvent Perot? Except this time it won't be over taxes. This time it'll be over right to life or something else. So in the broad sense, we will remain the socially conservative party. The Democrats will remain the socially liberal party. And I think it would be very hard for us not to do that. Yes?
Just to quickly change to your criticism of Obama's proposed energy tax, what do you think about the possibility that this tax will spur innovation, especially in alternative and renewable energy sources?
I think it might, but I think it's easier to do that by incentives. If you really want to spur innovation, have tax credits and prizes. Because I'm against punishing people, and I'm against the government getting the money. I mean, it's very clear this is a tax. This is not a plan to reshape incentives, because in their budget, they have $640 billion from the energy tax, and they have a little asterisk that says, by the way, there'll be a lot more than this. This is the amount we're reserving. Okay, so I think they think this will raise $1 trillion. Well, I'm a conservative. I don't think the current government is too small. I think it's too big. And so I want to shrink the current government, not grow it. And Obama wants to grow it. It's a fundamental difference about how you see the future.
One of the things I have an issue with on your Obama-Bush spending policy is that Obama, in addition to the spending raises, will also raise taxes. And don't you think that in terms of the energy tax, you need to find a way to fund these incentives towards innovation and efficiency?
Well, first of all, you pass a $787 billion stimulus package nobody's read, and then you tell me you need more money. Well, I'd rather take $400 billion out of the stimulus package if you want. I mean, you can't have it both ways. They like big government. They are the movement of big government. They want bigger government. They want more bureaucracy. They want politicians to have more power. That's not illegitimate. I just happen to think it's wrong. I think if you get a chance sometime, in Real Change, there's a chapter on Detroit. I really encourage you to read that one chapter. Detroit in 1950 had 1,800,000 people and the highest per capita income in the United States. Because of bad politicians and bad policies, the city of Detroit is under 900,000 people. It's the first American city to slip below 1 million, which means over half the housing stock in Detroit is vacant. They recently sold 1,800 houses for under $10,000 apiece. One of them went for $1. I mean, this is tragic, and it's all bad government policies. And my fear is that these guys will do for America what their ideology did for Detroit. Yes, ma'am.
What then can be the American comparative advantage economically in we won't stand a level of cheap labor that has made possible Walmart and has made possible some of these Asian car companies? What's the American solution to?
No, Toyota pays as much or more than General Motors.
Well, to create in America something that would then be well-paying jobs that would still remain globally competitive.
Well, that's why I think the things look. I believe to be the most competitive country in the world, which ought to be our goal. Because our goal should be the highest value-added jobs with the greatest productivity, which would then justify the highest incomes. Okay, to do that, and this is why we founded American Solutions, I think you have to reform litigation, regulation, taxation, education, health, energy, and infrastructure. I think this is and I'll give you a very simple example. I wrote, along with Bill Fortune and Steve Hanser, I wrote 2 novels about the Second World War, Pearl Harbor and Days of Infamy. From the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor on December 7th to victory over Japan in August of 1945 is 3 years and 8 months. Think about that. In 44 months, we mobilize the country, we defeat Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan in 44 months. It recently took us 23 years to add a 5th runway to the Atlanta airport. You're just not going to compete. We were promised in 2003 by the Department of Energy that they would build a green coal plant that would basically capture carbon because we have the largest supply of coal in the world. 27% of the world's coal is in the United States. Okay. In 2003, they said we'll build it by 2008. In 2008, they said we'll build it by 2016. The Chinese are opening their first experimental plant this year. Now, unless you fix this kind of incompetence and this, look at our schools. All of you ought to, here's a little project for your class. There is a movie called 2 Million Minutes. You can find it at 2mminutes.com. It's by Bob Compton, who was a health entrepreneur who sold a medical device for a lot of money. Then he went over. 2 Million Minutes is 4 years of high school. And I'll let you apply this to yourselves in just a second. And he takes 2 Indian high school students, 2 Chinese high school students, and 2 American high school students, and he studies them for 4 years. On his site, and what you learn, by the way, when you watch the movie, which is 54 minutes long, is you learn that we are a country aggressively preparing for the 1956 Olympics. That we're not going to win any medals because we're just totally out of sync with reality. On his website, because the Indian academic track is all English, he posts the English 10th grade exit exam in English. And he said over 4,000 people take it, none of them have passed it. You can try it if you want to. Turns out at the end of the 10th grade, and you have to pass this to go to the 11th grade if you want to stay in the academic track. Turns out by the end of the 10th grade in India, you've had 4 years of physics taught by a physics major. Nobody here can pass the exam. He put the Indian math curriculum on his website because it's also in English. And he has a 12-year-old in upstate New York who's doing calculus because he's worked his way through the whole. Now, of course, that means that he's totally out of the state curriculum committee's standards for 12-year-olds. He's totally breaking up the whole system of public education. And he's clearly to be a despised rate breaker who's doing too much and should be instead enjoying himself, doing nothing for the summer. It's a very interesting challenge. Let me give you all this simple test. When you went through high school, if we had had a program that said, if you go through in 3 years, we'll give you the entire 4th year's cost as an automatic scholarship, how many of you think you could have gotten through high school in 3 years? Raise your hand. Virtually unanimous. Okay? How many of you could have gotten through high school in 2 years? A third of the class. Just think about that. What we do today is you understudy, you underlearn. It's very expensive. We learn really bad habits. And then we're going to start running into competitors around the planet who pay attention all the time. This is a very serious challenge. And we're either going to decide that we want to be competitive so that you and your children and grandchildren are in the most successful country in the world, or we're going to decide we ought to decay elegantly because it's just too hard. This is historically probably the biggest challenge we've had since the Civil War. So, other questions? Yes, sir.
Shifting back into the social conservatism point, what do you make of Chairman Steele's comments lately, kind of going back and forth on some of the social issues, where he stands on that, and like, should we be trying to be open towards this kind of
practice more. Look, I talked to Michael yesterday. I mean, look, he's a smart guy. It is a huge jump from being lieutenant governor and U.S. Senate candidate to being the RNC chairman, and particularly being an African-American Republican chairman. I mean, so he has huge media pressure to perform every day, and he ought to just relax and back off, think through carefully what he's saying, and I think he's learning this. I don't think he realized the difference in intensity between showing up occasionally on Fox or CNN as a commentator and showing up as national chairman. But he is smart, and I think he's going to recover. I think he'll end up doing fine. I am for us having a very large party. I've always said to people, we are a center-right party. You cannot govern America from either wing. You can't be a left-wing party and be a majority. You can't be a right-wing party and be a majority. When I was elected whip, I carried New England in the whips race. I won the whips race by 2 votes, and I carried New England. When I was speaker, we deliberately maneuvered to protect all of our moderates because I realized they were under the most pressure. And if you want to be a majority, it's the last 20 votes that matter. It's fairly easy to be a minority. And the Democrats can be a minority pretty easily. The Republicans can be a minority pretty easily. Retreat to seats that are safe. Don't think, don't worry about it. You'll get reelected. And you end up with a pretty stupid party. But if you want to be a majority party in America, you have to have a very strong element in the center, and you have to compete everywhere. I mean, one of the things I most dislike about the last 10 years in my party is that we got into this cycle of trying to target cleverly. Well, what that does is it pulls you out of places. So there are lots of places where you're getting 40%, but you don't invest in them anymore because, after all, you're not competitive, which means next time you get 35%, which means pretty soon you're not competing at all. I'll tell you a true story. When I first ran in 1974, there was virtually no Georgia Republican Party. And we were in the middle of Watergate, and things were collapsing. And I said to the people who had decided that they would support my campaign, we are not going to target. We are going to campaign in every precinct in the district. And this is a little bit parallel to what Congressman Cowell did. And we are going to go after every vote. I said, I'm going to stipulate that I assume that my opponent, who was the ranking Democrat and the fourth leading, he was the dean of the delegation and the fourth ranking Democrat in the Appropriations Committee, and very powerful. And I said, I'm going to assume he's going to carry his family. But I'm not going to give an inch. And that was sort of the style we used. And so we were out. This is also the style we used in '94. I'll give you an example in a second. So we're out campaigning. Well, it turned out that his next door neighbor had a property fight with him and hated him. And so in early September, we get this phone call. This guy says, I want the biggest yard sign you have. Because I want that guy, I won't use the exact words he used, but you can imagine. I want that guy to drive past your sign every time he comes home. It'll drive him crazy, and I just want to drive him crazy. Well, we were a very poor campaign. So I actually went out. We had volunteers, and we painted a 4x8 sign.
I tell you, you and Bill Clinton, in the 1992 campaign, Bill Clinton campaigned in Wyoming, and at the end of the campaign went to Mississippi.
Yeah.
And I came out of the desk and said, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. And how did he get on the schedule? And he said that Governor Winter got his phone number and asked him to come, and he told him yes. So he wouldn't believe.
Of course.
He wouldn't believe that he couldn't carry Wyoming to Mississippi. We were like screaming and throwing things, and how stupid can we be? And I'm talking about, this had to be, you can look it up, it had to be like with 10 days left, or less than that.
Okay, and don't you currently have the governor of Wyoming?
We do. We had him that day because I think Mike Sullivan was a Democratic governor of Wyoming in 1992, but we didn't come close to carrying Wyoming.
No, but the point is, what you do is you revalidate for local volunteers who end up running. Now,
most good politicians hate targeting.
Yeah.
They all think they can get the guy. Just let me go.
And I want to draw a distinction. I do think if you think about one campaign, targeting matters. If you think as an institution, targeting is crazy. Because targeting blocks growth. And what you want to do is grow. I'll give you one other example. In '94, when we put together the campaign, and this was heretical. I mean, and this is a big long-term fight I've had with Republican consultants. We wanted to, because they had this model, well, we're going to pick up 22 seats, so we got to target them really carefully and raise all this money. We said, we tried this. I mean, I lost 7 times trying to create a majority for 14 years. And I said, if you only target a limited number of seats, the other side will drown you. So we're going to spread the field. We had 353 people sign the contract with America. We had 432 campaigns. We were campaigning in districts that hadn't seen a Republican in 30 years. But we picked up Rostenkowski's seat, which you could never have predicted as a model. You know, I think there's a pretty good chance we're going to beat Dodd, because Dodd now has so much baggage that if he doesn't drop out of the race, I think that'll be a Republican Senate seat next year. And it's not something you could pick up automatically. But if you get in the rhythm of competing everywhere, one of my favorite coaches when I was young in terms of study and coaching was Wooden. If you go back and look at a UCLA full court press, the goal of the full court press was to wear you out by having a team so well conditioned that they were everywhere all the time, and you never could start a play because they were in your face the whole time. And I think dominant majority parties behave like the UCLA full court press.
All right, this we can agree on, that if you look at the Republican Party, and we want to focus on this a little bit, the percentage of Republicans in the Congress from both the House and the Senate that are in the South has been rising.
Yes.
As it's gone down. All right. If you're in a Republican strategy session, and you're a big map Republican, just like in most good politicians, I'll share this with you. They hate targeting. I know Democrats, if you just let me get to that bank board, I'll get them all. Yeah, they're never going to be for you. I mean, I've been in this argument so many times in my life. And you know, I always lost the argument to the better politicians. But how much of it is a concern that you got a political party that is basically relying more and more on a sector of the country than it ever has?
Well, it's suicidal. I mean, if you become a regional party, you're not competitive. When I became Speaker, it was our turn to answer the President of the United States. And we picked Governor Whitman of New Jersey.
Sore topic in Louisiana, right?
Well, that's right. I wouldn't worry about it much. He'll do fine. But we picked the Governor Whitman because we wanted a female, moderate, northeastern governor outside of Washington. And that was a very conscious choice to send a signal that said, yeah, Gingrich is from Georgia and Armies from Texas and Trent Lott is from Mississippi, but this is a national party. And I think it's very important for the Republican Party, as one of its earliest planning gains is to get back into the Northeast and to get back into the Pacific Coast and decide that we're going to compete and get back into black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods and Asian American neighborhoods and just be determined we're going to compete everywhere. And frankly, I think the current problems are likely to make people interested in listening to us in a way that they might not have been.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
This is an unrelated question, but I don't know, I'm sure you're familiar with the recent Veterans Care Bill that was just passed by the Democrats. And I was wondering, on the one hand, Democrats seem to be fighting for some sort of universal health care system in one way or the other. But then on the other hand, they seem to be placing VA health care back on the soldiers by privatizing it. And I was wondering what your response was.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it. I can't comment. I just don't know enough. Yes, sir.
You just mentioned a minute ago about getting back in the Hispanic neighborhoods. In 2004, they got 44% of the Hispanic vote went to Bush. 2008, only 31%. How do you go about doing that when a faction of your party is very anti? I don't want to say anti-Hispanic, but anti-border issue.
Let me start and say I don't take any number in 2008 seriously, because I think 2008 was a performance election. They were going to give me one. That's okay. I'll take this one until they show back up. Thank you. That's nice of you. Let me share with you my personal experience for a minute. I'm going to eliminate the Bush-Obama financial bailout big spending plan. That's right. I was actually thinking the same thing. Okay. Okay. This is my personal experience. My dad was a career soldier, and I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and I went to, he was in the Korean War, and he came home, and we ended up going to Fort Riley, Kansas for 3 years. And then we went to Orléans, France, and we lived in France at a time when the French Fourth Republic was dying. They had 100% inflation. They were losing the war in Algeria, having earlier lost the war in Indochina, having lost the war to the Germans, and been liberated by us. We would drive to school past bomb damage every day. And in the spring of 1958, we went to the battlefield of Verdun, which was the largest battle in World War I, where 600,000 men were killed in the 9-month period. Thanks, James. And we, am I now like, I feel like I'm a really wealthy person in Diet Coke terms. You very seldom have a 2 Coke person right there in front of you. So this will probably become another example of Republican greed. Anyway, so we went and interesting, it was one of those magic things that happens that you think are almost providential. We stayed with a friend of my father's who'd been drafted in 1941, sent to the Philippines, served on the Bataan Death March, and ended up spending 3.5 years in a Japanese prison camp. And any of you who might have seen the Great Raid a couple years ago have some idea of what the Japanese prison camp's like. So here I am as a young kid. I was going to be either a vertebrate paleontologist or a zoo director. But it struck me that weekend that civilizations can die. This stuff's all real. And so we were transferred to Stuttgart that summer, and I spent about 3 months thinking and praying about it. And in August of '58, I decided to do what I have done ever since, which is really just three things. Figure out what has to be done for America to succeed. Figure out how you'd communicate it to the American